You know those photos that just stop you in your tracks and make you ask, what happened here? Today, we're diving into some jaw-dropping historical pictures that will leave you absolutely stunned. From the chilling halls of psychiatric hospitals to the daring heights of the Eiffel Tower, these images capture moments that shaped our world. Moments of courage, heartbreak, and even a little bit of mystery. Why was Steve Jobs cheekily refusing autographs? What's the story behind a bridge holding more people than expected? And who dared to turn timber into a floating building? Stick around, because these photos don't just tell stories, they'll leave you questioning what you thought you knew about history. Steve Jobs' typed letter. You know how some people go crazy over autographs from their favorite celebrities? Sports stars, musicians, and actors are usually at the top of the list. But for tech fans, it's the legends behind the gadgets and innovations we use every day. And who's more iconic in that world than Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple? Here's a question. What's the most surprising or clever autograph story you've ever heard? Back in 1983, when Apple wasn't yet the giant it is today, but was already turning heads with its groundbreaking computers, someone decided to ask Jobs for his autograph. The request came from L.N. Varon, a fan from Imperial Beach, California. His response? Classic Steve Jobs. He sent back a typed letter on Apple Computer Ink letterhead, dated May 11, 1983. The message was simple. I'm honored that you'd write, but I'm afraid I don't sign autographs. That could have been the end of the story, but Jobs, being Jobs, couldn't resist adding a cheeky twist. He signed the letter anyway, with his famous lowercase signature in black ink. Fast forward to 2021, and this little piece of history has become a hot commodity. The letter was auctioned off for a jaw-dropping $478,939. Isn't it wild how something so simple can turn into such a valuable collector's item? The auction house, RR Auction, called it a great early autograph from the Apple founder. And Jobs-related items have been in high demand. Signed business cards, an autographed iPad, even a Pirates of the Caribbean movie ticket stub with his signature. Here's something to think about. Why do you think Jobs avoided signing autographs but made an exception here in such a clever way? Maybe it was his way of staying true to himself while still giving fans something to remember him by. The doll and the patient. Have you ever seen a photo that just makes you stop and wonder? This one sure does. It's from the 1920s, taken at La Castañeda Psychiatric Hospital in Mexico, a place that became infamous for its questionable treatment methods and harsh conditions. So what's the story behind this haunting image? Take a closer look. The man in the photo is one of the hospital's patients, and he's holding a doll. At first glance, it might just look like a simple toy, but doesn't it seem eerily human-like? What do you think it meant to him? Back then, these kinds of dolls were often used as therapeutic tools in psychiatric care. They were meant to help patients express their emotions or connect with something comforting. In this photo, the doll almost becomes a symbol of that isolation. It's as if it blurred the line between reality and delusion for the patients, giving them something to hold on to in a world that had seemingly let them go. When you see this, what comes to mind? Sadness, curiosity, maybe even unease. Hardest tortured person in Norway. Let me take you back to a time of courage and resilience. Imagine this. It's World War II, and Norway is under Nazi occupation. Among the many stories of bravery, two names stand out: Olav Alsvik and Lauritz Sand. Bard Alsvik, who works in outreach, tells us about his grandfather, Olav Alsvik. Olav was a school principal, but during the war, he became prisoner number 1 at Grini, one of Norway's most notorious prison camps. Although Olav's time at Grini was relatively short, his story is one of quiet defiance. Unfortunately, Bard doesn't have a photo of his grandfather in the archives, but another photo caught his attention. A picture of Lauritz Sand, taken at the Liberation in May 1945. And let me tell you, Lauritz's story is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Lauritz Sand was known as Norway's most tortured man. Arrested in 1941, he endured years of unimaginable suffering at the hands of the Gestapo. They broke every bone in his arms and legs. He was subjected to 4 grueling years of relentless torture. The only word he ever gave them was no. Just think about that for a second. One word of resistance in the face of constant torture. How many of us could be that strong? Now here's the part that really sticks with me. There's a photo of Loritz taken after the war. By this time, he was bedridden and physically broken, but his spirit, unshaken. You can see it in his face, a quiet dignity, a survivor's strength. His simple bedside table, with everyday items, shows how humble his life was after enduring so much. Camberley Kate and Her Stray Dogs, 1962. Did you know every town has its quirky, unforgettable character? In Camberley, that person was Kate Ward, better known as Camberley Kate. Ever heard of her? She was famous for rescuing stray dogs and left a legacy that's still remembered today. Kate was born in 1895 in Middlesbrough and had a strict upbringing with her aunt. At 19, she moved south and eventually ended up in Camberley, but no one's quite sure why. Some say she might have worked as a servant for the Royal Military Academy. What do you think brought her there? In 1943, she bought her first house for £600, and that's where her mission to rescue dogs began. It all started with a lame greyhound that was about to be put down. Kate saved it, and from then on, she never turned away a stray. Can you imagine looking after more than 600 dogs in your lifetime? That's what Kate did. This photo, taken in 1962 in England, shows Kate Ward with her iconic cart filled with stray dogs. The cart was a gift from locals who admired her devotion, allowing her to parade through the streets with her rescued dogs. She had a small cottage on London Road, just down from a pub called The Lamb. Someone even built her a green wooden cart so she could take her dogs to the town centre every day to collect donations. And here's a fun fact: she sold postcards with her picture on them to raise money. Kate wasn't afraid to speak her mind, though. If someone tried to take a picture without donating, she'd let them know, loud and clear. But despite her feisty nature, she was incredibly generous. She gave money to her local church, bought toys for disabled kids, and even donated to a fund for Vietnamese orphans. Ravages of leprosy. This photo from 1895 tells a heartbreaking story about a disease that was once deeply misunderstood. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease. Back then, leprosy wasn't just a physical illness, it was a condition that came with heavy stigma, fear, and isolation. The man in this photo shows the severe effects of untreated leprosy. His face carries the visible scars of the disease, disfigurement caused by skin lesions, cartilage damage, and nerve destruction. In the late 19th century, treatments for leprosy were practically non-existent. Antibiotics like dapsone and rifampicin, which can cure the disease today, weren't discovered until the mid-20th century. Back then, people with leprosy were sent to isolated colonies, completely cut off from the rest of the world. Leprosy wasn't just seen as a disease, it was wrongly thought to be a curse or punishment. Because people didn't know it was caused by bacteria, those with leprosy faced intense discrimination and were often treated as outcasts. Thankfully, modern medicine has changed everything. Leprosy is now curable, and organizations like the World Health Organization have worked hard to reduce its prevalence. But here's the thing: stigma still lingers in some parts of the world. Woman in bandages. Back in 1940, at the San Juan de los Lagos Fair in Mexico, an unusual and thought-provoking scene was captured in this photograph. It shows a woman with her face wrapped in bandages and a crown of thorns resting on her head. Standing beside her is a man holding her arm, guiding her as they walk. On her chest, there's a nopal cactus with its sharp thorns pressed into her skin. Doesn't that sound intense? In her right hand, she holds a plate, which looks like it might be meant to catch the blood from her self-inflicted wounds during a ritual of flagellation. It's a striking mix of faith and physical sacrifice. This scene is a powerful example of religious syncretism, the blending of Catholicism with older traditions, where faith and sacrifice come together in unique, sometimes startling ways, and local rituals that you often find in Mexico. Little E's cell. Have you ever heard of a place so small and dark that it could break a person's spirit? Meet Little E's, a notorious torture cell hidden beneath the White Tower at the Tower of London. Doesn't that name alone give you chills? The cell earned its grim reputation for one reason: it was designed to make suffering inescapable. Take a second to imagine this. The cell measured just 1.2 meters square, so tiny that prisoners couldn't stand, sit, or even lie down comfortably. How do you think you'd manage, crammed into a space like that? To make it even worse, there was no light at all. Total blackness. Prisoners were left crouching in isolation for days, sometimes weeks, before being dragged out for interrogation and torture. The photo of Little Ease, taken by Sir Benjamin Stone in 1898, shows the cell's heavy wooden door slightly open, revealing nothing but an eerie darkness inside. Above the door, there's a plaque with its name, a haunting reminder of its history. This wasn't just a Tower of London thing. Cells like this were common in prisons across Europe at the time and used to crush both the body and the will of prisoners. Butcher selling opossums. Walking through New York City in 1916, you might stumble across something surprising. Opossums hanging outside a butcher shop, ready for sale. It's not exactly what we'd expect to see at a meat counter today, right? This photo, taken by the Bain News Service, shows a moment when Southern cuisine was making its way into northern cities. It features two butchers standing proudly outside their shop, their aprons stained with the marks of a hard day's work. A clear sign of the hands-on nature of the meat trade back then. The opossums are hung by their tails, a common way to display small animals at the time, meant to highlight their freshness and attract curious customers. Opossums, long a staple in rural southern diets, were suddenly in the spotlight after a grand banquet in 1909 honoring President-elect William Howard Taft. At that event, held in Atlanta, the opossum was the star dish. Can you imagine a national leader sitting down to a plate of baked opossum? What does that say about how food trends start? For many in the South, especially in rural and African-American communities, opossum meat was affordable and easy to find. It was often baked and paired with sweet potatoes, a combination that became a classic Southern dish. But after the Taft banquet, this humble food gained national attention. Northern markets, including those in bustling New York City, began selling opossums to curious customers. At the time, it wasn't unusual for butcher shops to hang game or poultry outside to show off their freshness. Opossums joined the lineup of meats being marketed to urban crowds, especially in neighborhoods with diverse immigrant populations and varying culinary traditions. An inmate about to meet guillotine. Around 1925, at the Cayenne Penal Colony in French Guiana, better known as Devil's Island, a chilling moment was captured. The photograph shows a guillotine, poised for a death sentence to be carried out. It wasn't just an instrument of execution, it was a terrifying symbol of the harsh and unforgiving justice system used in the colony. Devil's Island was infamous for its brutality. This was no ordinary prison. It was a place where convicts, including political prisoners and hardened criminals, were sent to face near certain death. Do you think anyone truly believed they'd make it out alive? Malnutrition, disease, abuse, and backbreaking labor were the daily reality. With such inhumane conditions, they had a terrifying solution: the guillotine. Doesn't it sound like something out of a horror story? The guillotine was nicknamed the Merry Widow, and inmates were forced to watch executions. Afterward, the executioner would hold up the severed head and declare, "Justice has been done in the name of the people of France." How would anyone endure witnessing something like that? Truth behind giant croc. There's an old photo that often pops up online showing a massive crocodile, with captions claiming it's a 28-foot beast, killed in Queensland, Australia in 1957. Sounds wild, right? But the truth is a bit different. While the photo is real, the story behind it isn't quite accurate. What do you think makes people believe such stories so easily? The picture was actually taken much earlier, likely in 1914 along the Roper River in the Northern Territory of Australia. It shows a crocodile, sure, but its size isn't confirmed. It looks gigantic because of a camera trick called forced perspective. Have you noticed how things closer to the camera always look bigger? That's what's happening here. The two people in the picture are standing behind the crocodile, making it seem larger than it really is. Here's another question. Do you think there could ever be a 28-foot crocodile? Experts say it's pretty much impossible. The biggest crocodile ever measured was Lolong, who was over 20 feet long, and he held the record until he died in 2013. The current largest living crocodile, Cassius, is about 18 feet long. The largest crocodiles in the wild rarely get bigger than 23 feet, and that's extremely rare. So the idea of a 28-foot croc seems more like a myth. Speaking of myths, there's a famous Australian story about a crocodile nicknamed Chris. In 1957, Christina Pawlowski reportedly killed a crocodile said to be 28 feet long. But there's no proof, and scientists are skeptical. Have you heard about this kind of larger-than-life tale before? Why do you think people keep passing these stories around? There's even a life-size replica of Chris in the town of Normanton, Queensland. It's fun to see, but without evidence, it's just a legend. As for the viral photo, it probably got paired with the story about Chris, because it's a dramatic image. Mummies at Museo de las Momias. In 1957, two visitors stood face-to-face with something unforgettable: the famed mummies of Guanajuato. Have you heard about them? They're not just artifacts, they're real people, naturally mummified and eerily preserved in haunting detail. What would it feel like to stand in a room surrounded by rows of upright mummies, some still wearing fragments of their clothes? The Museo de las Momias in Guanajuato, Mexico, houses these remarkable remains discovered under some unusual circumstances. In the 19th century, families in Guanajuato had to pay a special grave tax to keep their loved ones buried. If the fee wasn't paid, the graves were opened to make space for new burials. When the first exhumations began in the 1860s, workers were shocked to find that many of the bodies hadn't decomposed. They'd been naturally mummified. Why do you think that happened? It turns out that Guanajuato's dry climate, mineral-rich soil, and airtight crypts created perfect conditions for preserving these bodies. The result? Dozens of mummies with skin, teeth, and hair intact, and even some standing upright. Doesn't that sound like something straight out of a movie? At first, the mummies were stored away from public view, but curiosity got the better of people. By the early 20th century, they were put on display. And today, they're one of Mexico's most unique attractions. The mummies aren't just scientific oddities, they hold a deep cultural significance. In Mexico, death isn't something to be feared or ignored. It's embraced and even celebrated. Traditions like Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, reflect this rich relationship with mortality. The mummies of Guanajuato add another layer to that dialogue, confronting visitors with the reality of death while reminding them of the individuality of each person who became a mummy. Flying toward hope. Transport planes in 1946 were nothing like the planes we know today. But for the passengers in this photo, those simple webbed seats symbolized something far greater: a chance at a new life. This image shows Puerto Ricans leaving their island behind and heading to New York during what's now called the Great Puerto Rican Migration. After World War II, life in Puerto Rico was tough. The island struggled with poverty, unemployment, and limited opportunities. Meanwhile, cities like New York were booming, and industries needed workers. With jobs waiting on the mainland and air travel becoming more affordable, thousands of Puerto Ricans packed their hopes and dreams and boarded flights like this one. What would you have done in their place? Stayed home or leapt? Before the 1940s, travel between Puerto Rico and the mainland meant long, uncomfortable boat rides. But the introduction of surplus military planes turned migration into a quicker, if still rough, experience. Just look at this photo. No fancy seats, no in-flight service, just bare-bones transport. By the mid-1940s and into the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans moved to places like New York City, transforming neighborhoods such as Spanish Harlem or El Barrio into cultural hubs. These communities became the foundation for Puerto Rican culture in the US. Workers on Eiffel Tower. What would it feel like to stand hundreds of feet above the ground, balancing on scaffolding, building what would become one of the most famous landmarks in the world? Back in 1888, workers in Paris did exactly that as they constructed the Eiffel Tower. Can you believe they were working at such dizzying heights with only basic safety measures? This incredible photo from that time shows workers perched high above the Paris skyline, carefully piecing together the iron framework of Gustave Eiffel's ambitious project. At that moment, they weren't just building a tower. They were reshaping the city's skyline and making history. Now here's a question. How do you think these workers felt as they climbed onto the scaffolding each day? The Eiffel Tower wasn't just an engineering challenge, it was a symbol of progress, innovation, and the future. And yet, for the people constructing it, it meant taking risks daily, with only rudimentary safety gear protecting them. When the Eiffel Tower was completed in 1889, it became the tallest man-made structure in the world, a stunning achievement. But here's something to think about. While the tower stands as a global symbol of Paris, how often do we remember the hands that built it? This image is a rare glimpse into the teamwork, resilience, and sheer grit it took to bring Gustave Eiffel's vision to life. Floating wooden buildings. Picture this. You're standing on the banks of a massive Russian river in the 1800s, and instead of spotting a traditional ship, you see what looks like a floating wooden building gliding downstream. It's not a ship at all, it's a massive disposable timber barge. Pretty creative, right? Back in 19th century Russia, timber was a big deal. It was used for everything: construction, fuel, and even shipbuilding. But here's the challenge. How do you move huge amounts of timber from remote forests to bustling cities? The rivers, like the Volga and Dnieper, became natural highways. But floating logs individually wasn't working. Too much wood got lost or damaged. So what was the solution? The answer was genius. Build a ship entirely out of timber. These weren't ships meant to last, they were disposable barges designed for one-way trips. The whole thing, frame, walls, deck, was made of wood, held together with simple joinery and almost no metal, so it could be taken apart easily at the end of the journey. Can you believe some of these barges were up to 400 feet long? That's longer than a football field. Here's where it gets even more interesting. These barges had no sails, no engines, nothing fancy. They relied entirely on the river's current to move. Workers on board used long oars or basic rudders to steer. Once the barge reached its destination, usually a port or a processing hub, it was dismantled on the spot. Every single piece of wood was sold as raw material. No need for a return trip. This clever method wasn't just about saving money, it showed how resourceful people were at solving big problems with what they had. The rivers were full of these timber barges, a reminder of how important the timber industry was to Russia's economy. Buckingham Palace stables. Have you ever thought about what it takes to keep a royal family on the move in style? Back in May 1905, a photographer named Bedford Lemaire captured an incredible shot inside the Buckingham Palace stables, also called the Royal Mews. This wasn't just any stable, it was the heart of royal transportation. The Royal Mews, located right at Buckingham Palace, was where the British monarchy kept their carriages and horses. These stables weren't just for show. They played a huge role in ceremonial events, like coronations, weddings, and state visits. So here's a fun thought. How much work do you think went into keeping everything looking spotless and running smoothly? Looking at this photo, you'll see vaulted ceilings, perfectly arched windows, and a symmetrical layout. Doesn't it make you wonder why even the stables were built with such elegance? This wasn't just about housing horses, it was about upholding royal standards. The stalls were clean, organized, and lined with straw bedding, ready for the horses that symbolized royal prestige. By 1905, automobiles were starting to pop up everywhere, but for the British royal family, horses and carriages were still a huge deal, especially for big events. The photo also shows a figure in formal attire, probably a stable master or attendant. Can you imagine overseeing the care of royal horses and ensuring the stables stayed impeccable? Every detail had to reflect the monarchy's status. Olympic first-class suites. Step into a world of unmatched luxury aboard the RMS Olympic, a sister ship to the Titanic. This photograph shows a first-class stateroom on the sea deck, a glimpse into how the wealthiest passengers traveled in style. The Olympic, launched in 1910, was the first of the White Star Line's grand Olympic-class ocean liners, paving the way for the Titanic and Britannic. Designed to compete with Cunard's luxury liners, the Olympic was all about elegance, comfort, and size. Unlike Titanic's tragic fate, the Olympics had a long and successful career, even earning the nickname Old Reliable. Take a closer look at this stateroom. It's a showcase of Edwardian style, with intricate wood paneling, plush armchairs, and a writing desk where passengers could draft letters or prepare for formal dinners. Stained glass windows allowed soft, natural light to filter in, while ornate electric lamps added a modern touch of sophistication. Doesn't it remind you of a high-end hotel room rather than a cabin on a ship? These first-class rooms came with en-suite bathrooms, an incredible luxury for the time. Imagine being able to travel across the ocean with the kind of comfort that was unheard of for most people in that era. Interestingly, the staterooms on the Olympics were almost identical to those on the Titanic. That means this image gives us a rare peek into what life was like for Titanic's wealthiest passengers, including figures like John Jacob Astor IV and Benjamin Guggenheim. Do you think the allure of such luxury made them feel invincible, even as they faced the dangers of sea travel? Detectives dumped drugs into incinerator. Back in the spring of 1963, something unusual was happening at a sanitation facility in New York City. Law enforcement officers and a property clerk named Thomas Rossetti were dumping suitcases full of illegal drugs into a blazing incinerator. This scene was part of a larger effort to fight the growing drug crisis in the US, especially in cities like New York. By the 1960s, drug use and trafficking were becoming a big concern, and events like this were meant to send a strong message. The government was serious about cracking down on organized crime and illegal drugs. Look closely at the photo from that day. The suitcases being emptied into the incinerator were packed with narcotics like heroin and cocaine. The sheer quantity points to how large-scale smuggling operations have become. Incinerating the drugs wasn't just about destruction. It was about making sure they couldn't be recovered or reused. Back then, this was one of the few ways to safely and publicly get rid of confiscated narcotics. This moment also captures a turning point in the US approach to drug-related crimes. Just a few years later, stricter laws like the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 would come into play, and President Nixon would officially launch the war on drugs in 1971. Heart of West Street's commerce. New York City's streets have always been alive with energy, but imagine the chaos back in the 1880s when West Street in Lower Manhattan became one of the busiest places in town. The reason? The massive shipping of oysters and produce along the Hudson River. Take a look at a snapshot from around 1895. Horse-drawn carts and streetcars clogging the street, signs advertising everything from fruits to imported wines, and people hustling in every direction. Businesses along West Street were booming. Signs for places like Meacham and Farnham Fruits, J. Roma & Co. Flour and Seed, and William Dinwoodie Imported Brandies and Wines tell the story of a thriving trade district. The Hudson River was the lifeblood of this bustling sea scene. Ships would dock to unload goods, which were then transported by wagons to markets and businesses throughout the city. How different do you think city life felt back then compared to today when trucks and highways have replaced horses and streetcars? It wasn't just the goods that brought people here. It was the energy and opportunities of a growing city. West Street was a hub for commerce, culture, and connection. Soldiers on the eve of war. Ever thought about the mix of emotions soldiers felt as they stood on a train platform, ready to head into the unknown? This photograph from 1914 shows two British soldiers at London's Victoria train station, preparing to leave for the front lines as World War I began. At the start of the war, there was a wave of patriotism across Britain. Thousands of young men enlisted, many believing the conflict would be over quickly. Train stations like the one in this photo became powerful symbols of the war effort. They were places of tearful goodbyes and last hugs from loved ones. Take a closer look at the soldiers in this scene. One is carrying a rifle, and both are dressed in their crisp khaki uniforms, standing quietly on the platform, their kit bags slung over their shoulders. Their packs are filled with essentials, clothing, blankets, and rations. They were about to board a train that would take them to the battlefields of France. What makes this image so striking is its mix of optimism and foreboding. In 1914, many soldiers left with smiles and confidence, not yet aware of the horrors waiting on the battlefields. The train in the background feels symbolic, don't you think? It's not just a vehicle, It's a metaphor for leaving behind the safety of home and heading straight into the chaos of war. Golden Gate Bridge's opening day. May 1937 must have been an unforgettable time in San Francisco. Crowds poured onto the newly opened Golden Gate Bridge, eager to walk across what was then a groundbreaking engineering marvel. Here's something to think about. What would it feel like to be one of the first people to step onto such an iconic structure, not knowing if it could hold up under the weight of so many? One photo from that day shows a massive crowd. Someone ran it through a counting algorithm and came up with around 2,617 people. And that's just the visible part of the bridge. There were likely many more beyond the curve. The engineers must have held their breath as the bridge handled the unexpected weight. It sank slightly under the pressure, but stayed steady. Talk about a real-time stress test. The Golden Gate Bridge wasn't just an engineering feat. It was a symbol of progress and connection, linking San Francisco to Marin County. For people in the 1930s, it represented hope during the Great Depression. Looking at that photo, it's easy to see the excitement and curiosity on people's faces. Imagine the stories they must have told about that day. The thrill of walking across the bridge, the views of the bay, and the sense of being part of history. Which one shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fascinating stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.